Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the not too distant past, during the rule of the Dawlatul Uthmaniyah, or the Ottoman Empire as it's known in English, at the time before Sykes-Picot cut up the Muslim world giving it new names, and Bilad-i-Sham existed instead of Palestine, Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. At that time, Baytul Maqdis was in the control of the Muslims, and the Muslims lived unhindered by anyone. At that time, there were still many great ulama being produced from every corner of the Islamic world. And so we find ourselves in the year 993 after Hijrah. Almost 1,000 years had passed since the Hijrah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and once again a star of guidance was born, one that was said to be the Mujaddid of his age. His name was Imam Khayruddeen ibn Ahmad ibn Nuruddin al-Ayyubi al-Faruqi Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah, better known just as Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah. Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah was born in a place called Ramla, which is located inside present-day Palestine, under the stolen and occupied section of the city by the Jews. It is different to the famous Palestinian city known as Ramallah, which is located within the West Bank. There's roughly a distance of 45 kilometers between Ramla and Ramallah. And it was in this Ramla that Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah was born. Now there were many ulama that were Ramlis, but for the Hanafi madhab, when we speak of Imam Ar-Ramli, then we mean only Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah. Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah comes from a noble lineage because he traces himself back to Hazrat Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhu, hence the title of Al-Faruqi in his name. Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah, like other ulama before him, spent his youth learning and memorizing the Quran. And then at the age of 14 years old, together with his older brother, Imam Tajuddin Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah, they traveled to Egypt and began their studies at Al-Azhar. Originally, Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah wanted to study the Shafi'i madhab, but his brother Imam Tajuddin Rahimahullah had chosen the Hanafi madhab, and he convinced his brother to study the Hanafi madhab as well. Or at least I should say that the actual convincing itself came less from Imam Tajuddin Rahimahullah, even though he was the driving factor behind it, but the real thing that made up Imam Khayruddin's mind was when he fell asleep while pondering over which of the two madhabs to study. And that night, he saw Imam Shaafi Rahimahullah in a dream. And Imam Shaafi Rahimahullah told him that we are all on the Siratul Mustaqim, we are all on the straight path. The next morning, Imam Khayruddin Rahimahullah mentioned this dream to one of the ulama who interpreted it for him, saying that what Imam Shaafi Rahimahullah meant was that all of the madhahib are on the haqq, and that he should follow his brother and study the Hanafi madhab. So Imam Khayruddin Rahimahullah joined his brother in the Hanafi classes. This was roughly about the time when Imam Ashrun Bulali Rahimahullah would also have been studying at Al-Azhar, as Imam Khayruddin Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah was only 1 year older than Imam Ashrun Bulali Rahimahullah. So although they may possibly not have been in the same classes together, they were nonetheless still studying at the same institute at the same time and had many of the same teachers in common. Amongst those teachers was Imam Abdullah al-Nahriri Rahimahullah, who at the time was the rector of Al-Azhar. Imam al-Nahriri Rahimahullah was so impressed by Imam Khayruddin Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah that he invited both Imam Khayruddin and Imam Tajuddin Rahimahumullah to come to his house for extra lessons privately. Imam Khayruddin Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah soon surpassed his older brother in knowledge, becoming a mufassir, a muhaddith and a faqih. And he received the recognition of all the ulama of Al-Azhar. Upon the completion of his studies, Imam Khayruddin Rahimahullah returned to his hometown of Ramla, and immediately he began conducting dini classes and issuing fatwa. Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah operated independently of any sponsors. So in order to create a sustainable source of income, Imam Khayruddin Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah began buying fertile lands upon which he had figs and olive trees planted, as well as orchards of fruit. As these lands began producing crops and money started coming in, Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah bought more land and expanded his business in this manner, all while continuing the classes of fiqh that he was offering. The barakah that Allah placed in the efforts of Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah began to bear fruit. literally. And soon from the profits of the harvests of those lands, Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah was not only able to sustain himself and his family, but in fact it grew to the extent that many madaris were being upkept by Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah. But it did not end there, because now that Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah had become a wealthy businessman, he did not hoard his wealth for himself, rather he spent it for the sake of Allah. So from his money, he would build masajid. And from his money, he would sponsor students that sought to study the deen but were unable to do so due to their financial situation. For the teachers that desired to teach the deen but were forced to work in order to earn, Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah would pay them from his own money to free them of the worries of earning so that they could teach the deen of Allah. Furthermore, Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah began to grow his library. So he would at times he would buy multiple copies of a kitab. Not merely to have his shelves standing full of books, but the purpose of this library was to support the ulama who may not have had access to many kitabs. And he would often send kitabs to the ulama in the countryside, gifting it to them so that they could use it when teaching others again. And this was the reason for buying multiple copies of a kitab. Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah continued in this manner, and his fame spread across the Muslim world that people far and wide began seeking his fatwa on matters. The fatwa of Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah were compiled into a kitab entitled Al-Fatawa Al-Khayriyya li Naf'i Al-Bariyya, or simply Fatawa Khayriyya. And these fatwa were used and relied upon by the ulama in their kitabs and fatwa as well. Imam Ibn Abidin Ash-Shami Rahimahullah references it as well in his kitab Raddul Muhtar. The exceptional effort for the deen and the effect that Imam Khayruddeen Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah had on the world made it that the ulama had listed him as the mujaddid of his time. Imam Ar-Ramli Rahimahullah passed away in Ramla in the year 1081 after Hijrah at the age of 88 years old. This was an Imam who spent his entire life and his wealth for the sake of the deen of Allah, not for personal gain. May Allah greatly increase his reward and guide us along the straight path so that we can live and work for the sake of the deen as well. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen wa akhiru da'wana anil hamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.